Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. And I am your host, Niels Eichhorn, and unfortunately, I was supposed to be joined today by my partner in crime on these events sometimes, Andrew Haupt, but I guess our visit together in Prague was a little too much for him, and he had to unfortunately say no, but he might join us later in the podcast recording. So we'll see. Hopefully he will have time and feel better shortly, but we he will definitely join me in a few weeks when we have another one of these recordings with another author, or we might actually bring our guest for today back for a second sitting and some additional conversation if there's interest on all of our parts. So for today, I got probably the most contemporaneously contemporaneous topic possible. And it was Andrew's idea to actually do this book. And I'm very glad that our author agreed to join me to this. So I have Benjamin Railton, or Ben Railton, like he has on his book cover. He is a professor of English study at Fitchburg State University and is the author of a number of books, including, but not limited to, Redefining American Identity, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the book we are going to talk about today, Of Thee I Sing, The Contested History of American Patriotism by Roman and Littlefield. So, ye obviously there has been a history, pun intended, of writing about subjects related to patriotism, identity, belonging. So, Ben, first of all, thanks so much for joining me tonight. And then, how did you come to write this book?
That's a good starting point. And also, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Niels. And I'll just say Andrew is certainly with us in spirit. We've been connected, he and I, online on social media for many years, and he's with us too. And I'm sending my thoughts his way. But yeah, so for me, there's sort of two different ways to frame the starting point of this, and I think they're both really relevant not only to the book but to kind of why I do the work that I do and where my work comes from. The first of which is a quote from a completely different book, or a book that might seem completely different anyway, that had been a really important quote for me since I first read it as a college student in the 1990s. And that's a quote from the opening chapter of the first book of George R.R. Martin's series, the Song of Ice and Fire series that came to be the TV show Game of Thrones. The first book of that series is called A Game of Thrones. And in the opening chapter of that, there was a quote that hit me when I first read it in like 1997 and had really stayed with me as a kind of shaping point for the way I wanted to think about things. And that quote is between a son and father, two of the main characters, a young man, a boy named Bran, who is 7 years old, and his father, Ned Stark, very famous from the TV show. And they're riding back from an execution that his father has performed. And the brothers are debating whether the man had died bravely or as a coward. And young Bran is kind of thinking about it in his own head. He's only 7 and he's trying to figure it out. And his dad asks him what he's thinking about. And so Bran tells him, and Bran asks his dad, he says, "Can a man be brave when he's afraid?" And his dad, Ned, says, "That is the only time that he can be brave." And I really, really loved that quote because it's not just sort of like challenging the easy way that we might think about something. We might think about bravery as the opposite of fear, that if you're brave, it means you don't have fear. It's not just challenging that and saying, no, in fact, those things can coexist, but it's going a step further and saying that's the only time that you can't have bravery without fear. You can't have the positive thing without the negative thing. And I think a lot of my thinking and a lot of my career, I've been trying to do that work of sort of holding these things together, holding things that might feel like they're opposed to each other, but thinking about how they can coexist and how that maybe helps us think more thoughtfully and productively about things that we might oversimplify sometimes. And I would say I've applied that to a whole lot of different things, including even just like America and American identity. But I really started to think about that with patriotism specifically because of very current events kind of reasons, which is the other sort of origin point for a lot of my work. There's just great works of literature and culture and how they inspire me, like Martin's book. And then there's current events kind of questions and how they inspire a lot of my work. And so in the early 2010s, it was the Obama presidency, and a lot of critiques of Obama emphasized this idea that he was doing things like apologizing for America
Mhm.
by talking about our hardest histories and our darkest pasts and some of the most painful things in America. And that doing that was not patriotic, that it was,
Mhm.
again, apologizing for America or attacking America. The 2012 election had a lot of those narratives, for example.
Mhm.
And so I started to think how much I disagreed with that and how much that
Mhm.
narrative depended on a definition of patriotism,
Mhm.
which was one thing and not the other.
Mhm.
It was about love and not criticism. It was about
Mhm.
only the positive and not the negative. And I started to kind of develop this idea that what if we think about patriotism as having to include both sides?
Mhm.
And I wrote about that on my blog first, and then that got picked up by this really great magazine called America Magazine at the time as a piece where I argued that that is the only time that we can be patriotism, to use the be patriotic, to use the Martin quote, that the
Mhm.
only time we can be patriotic is when we're being critical. That
Mhm.
it's not either or, that both things have to be true at the same time. And since then, I've thought a lot more about it, including in this book that we'll talk more about. And I think there are multiple types. I don't think that's
Mhm.
the only type, but I still would argue that it's the best type. It's the most meaningful and productive type, is the patriotism that is both critical and
Mhm.
patriotic, that is both
Mhm.
critical and loving of the nation. And I would connect that to another quote that I have discovered since I started working on all of this, and is one of my favorite quotes of all time in American writing, which is from James Baldwin, the great African American writer of the 20th century, who wrote in his essay Notes on a Native Son very early in his career, I love America more than any other nation in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. And
Mhm.
it's that exactly for this reason that I really love, that the love and the criticism exactly interconnect. They
Mhm.
have to be there together. And I think that really sums up a lot of what I want to argue for with this other version, this alternative, and I think ultimately more meaningful version of patriotism. So those are some of the places that this kind of developed out of for me.
Yeah, and I kind of find it interesting that I having written books myself, it takes a while to write these. Uh, but it's interesting when you say that you start kind of thinking about this by the 2012 election and kind of designing this, and like obviously we can't see the future, right? And we can't anticipate all the things that are happening and are going to happen. And it's did you have any kind of inkling that this would be like by the time you publish such a big topic?
I think I did because of the way some of those narratives about America were developing. And an example
Mm,
that I would point to that's even kind of bigger than the critiques of Obama I was just mentioning was the early version of what would become Make America Great Again,
hmm.
which was the phrase, I want my country back.
Yeah.
That was like a rallying cry of the right under Obama. I want my
Hmm.
country back.
Yeah.
And it just really got me thinking, what vision of America are they using? What is that my country
Hmm.
that they're arguing for?
Right.
And I did. I think I could see that becoming this like shaping debate
Hmm.
about, okay, so how do we define this whole country? How do we
Hmm.
define America? How do we define American identity? Who is part of it? Who
Right.
is not? How do we look at our history?
Hmm.
How do we think about patriotism? I do think a lot of the last 20 years or so, 15, 20 years, have been shaped by those huge debates. And so
Hmm.
I could see them kind of churning. And I did feel, I think as I tried to become more of a public scholar, that was a lot of what I was thinking is I feel like I have things to say about these big debates. And I
Hmm.
think they're going to have a lot to do with shaping a lot of other things in our country. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, and fortunately, maybe if we're going to have them genuinely anyway, these debates, that's where we've gone in the last decade, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's and I think we'll get into some of this or like as we said earlier, maybe a second part where we can with Andrew kind of talk about some of the contemporary historic connections that are existing there. But before we get into some of the material in the book, I kind of wanted to also talk about because I want to say 95% of the people that I usually have conversations with are historians. And you're in English. You do American studies. So I kind of want to first of all kind of talk a little about how do you feel like you approach the subject differently? What does English give you methodologically that kind of allows you to kind of maybe differently think about patriotism and the source materials that you then use for your work?
I appreciate that. It's an important. I'm always a big believer in trying to be thoughtful and reflective about what we do and how we do it and why
Hmm.
we do it, and I appreciate the chance to include that in a conversation. I will say I am indebted to all kinds of other scholarly work all the time, including the work of historians.
Hmm.
And so it's not either or for me at all, of course. But for me, I think there's a couple things, and then I'll say one thing about American studies, which is how I've kind of ultimately seen my own work since at least graduate school and even really undergrad, where I did a kind of American studies major as an undergrad too. But as an English professor, as someone who's been in that discipline for 20 years at Fitchburg State and grad school before that, I would say two big things. One is my interest in the idea of narratives,
Mm.
in the stories that we tell. And I know historians have lots of interest in that too, but certainly I come at that, at least in part, as someone who's just interested in story and storytelling. And I think so many of our ideas about America, about history and collective memory and patriotism and our stories, they're narratives and they're kind of competing ones and
Right.
interconnected ones. And I think that interest has come in part out of working with literary texts and cultural
Mhm.
works so much of the time. And then a second layer to that is that I'm really, really interested in the idea of close reading.
Mhm.
As an English professor, it's a kind of main thing that I try to teach and work on in my classes and with my students. I'm teaching a summer class right now, and their first short paper is a close reading paper where they're required not to even have a thesis. There's no big argument. It's just about like, look at what's happening in this text
Mhm.
really closely in
Mm.
whatever text they choose. And that can happen in any discipline, but I certainly think it's a key part of English studies of what we
Mm.
do when we work with our texts. And I think that can serve us really well in making sure that we're really being thoughtful about the evidence and about
Mm.
the texts of all kinds in front of us, while we then try to get to bigger arguments and bigger ideas. And so I
Mm.
think that close reading emphasis certainly has been important for me. And then the American studies side, and you just kind of hinted at this, but um, it is true in English studies that people have become more willing to look at texts that are not just literary ones.
Mhm.
But there is still a traditional model that is more
Mm.
creative literature as the focus.
Mm.
But my interest from the very beginning of any of my work as a student, as a scholar, has not really cared about what genre or media we're looking at. I'm
Mm.
very willing and happy to put a film in conversation with a song, with a photograph, with a poem, with a speech, with
Mhm.
whatever other documents. I think one of the great things about American studies as an approach is it reminds us that these are all part of the
Mhm.
cultural and social landscape, and all texts can be part of what we're analyzing and working with. And so I hope for this book, people can see how
Mhm.
willing I am to put a song in conversation with a movie, with a novel, with a speech, with whatever else you got to help open up these questions. And I think that interdisciplinary
Mhm.
textual approach is a big part of what I try to do as well.
No, and I will say from at least my perspective, I really enjoyed that you had sort of the literary text, and then you had like some movies in there, and like the pieces where I kind of was like, oh, that didn't think of that, and it was kind of a nice combination of the different perspectives and kind of giving then voices to different people as well through that. So that was definitely enjoyable and made the text flow relatable, I guess. So I, I, I guess related to that is how did you find the characters? Like you have a number of individuals, usually like two or three characters for each chapter, and like how did you like? There's so many. How did you pick?
Yeah, and that is partly how these things, develop over time, as you had
Mm.
said about books, that I had been thinking about these questions in a focused way, at least for almost a decade by the time the book comes out anyway in 2021, and
Mm.
something like, 7 or 8 years. And so as I had it in mind, you then encounter quotes or moments or
Mm.
speeches or voices, as you say, and you kind of you file them away as, oh, that's a really interesting
Mm.
voice. Like just an example of that is the guy August Spies. I think it's Spies. He's a German American, so you would
Mm.
know better than me. Spies. It could be Spies.
Sure.
Who is
Yes.
one of the anarchists who's on trial at the
Mm,
Haymarket trial in 1885. He gives this amazing closing speech to the judge after
mhm,
the conviction at that crazy farcical show trial. He gives the speech about why he is much more patriotic than
mm,
those who have prosecuted him. And so I had just always filed that away as a really interesting
mhm.
commentary on patriotism in America from this guy
Right.
who was being labeled an alien radical outsider, but who was saying, "No, I'm more of a patriotic American." So that's one
Mhm,
example that I had kind of filed away, and so I had a lot of those. I had a lot of those that I had just been thinking about kind of more individually, who then became part of the chapters and part of the
mhm,
project. But the flip side of that also is that when I knew I wanted to do the chapters chronologically,
mhm,
um, 8 chapters across sort of 8 different moments in American history
mhm,
from the Revolution through the end of the 20th century. It really helped me then to kind of go to those different moments and
mhm,
think about things that might not initially look like they're just about patriotism, but that I felt like I could do something with. So an example would be like the muckraking journalists of the
mhm,
progressive era, somebody like Ida Tarbell.
mhm,
She's not explicitly writing about patriotism per se, but I think the way she's criticizing Standard
mhm.
Oil is a really interesting example of critical patriotism,
Right.
of saying this can help push the country toward a better place if we're
Mhm,
willing to offer these critiques. So it was partly things I had filed away, and then it was also partly kind of going to the different time periods and spending some time trying to think about what's happening, what are voices, what are texts
mhm.
that might be part of these debates over patriotism in these different moments.
So how many of those texts did your students have to read in like American literature?
A good number. I do always see these parts of the work as intersecting, as I'm sure most of us do, our teaching, our writing, our
Mhm,
thinking, the things we love, the things that we are defined by. So I don't know what the percentage is, but every chapter has at least a few things that I've taught a lot, that I
mm,
myself love and have been thinking about for
right.
decades. But then again, there definitely were at least a couple in each chapter that were brand new in my
Mhm,
thinking that I hadn't. An example of that is the John Wayne film, The Green Berets, in the chapter on
mm,
the 60s. I had
yeah.
heard of that film over the years, but I didn't really know anything about it. I just knew I probably wanted to include it in that chapter. So I learned a lot more and checked it
Mm,
out. And so that was what I really didn't have any prior experience with until I was writing about it and thinking about it. So it's definitely an intersection of a lot of different
mm.
stuff.
So you made yourself sit through the groveling old John Wayne and his always same personality in in the movies.
And the end of that film, I just have to say, sorry to spoil it for people, but it's one of the most extreme examples imaginable of the negative effects of the worst kind of patriotism.
Mm,
Because the other main character in that movie is a journalist who is kind of along with the Green Berets in Vietnam. And he's very critical of them throughout the film.
mm,
And then at the end, he's been so convinced by John Wayne's mythic patriotism that he picks up a rifle and is firing at the North Vietnamese in battle as a journalist, which I'm pretty
uh,
sure is a war crime. I'm pretty sure that's like a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, but we're supposed to be cheering for it as like the perfect effect of John Wayne's patriotism. So this is the kind of stuff you have to encounter if you want to talk about debates over patriotism.
it always reminds me of that. You might have not seen it. William Walker. Walker's a
Mm-hmm.
movie
Mm-hmm.
and has a
Mm-hmm.
filibuster, and it's like everything is said nicely in the 1850s, and then you get to that last moment, and they're getting rescued there by helicopters.
Yeah.
And you're like, why? Why? How did this just happen?
Yeah.
Oh, Hollywood. Sometimes, yeah. Well, I guess we could have a whole conversation about Hollywood and
We
patriotism
could. We
in
could.
that regard. So how do you then define patriotism? I guess that we should talk about that because it's key to the book, and
It is.
proper
It
definition will be
is.
useful.
It is. And so and it was important to me as I transitioned from what I had talked about in our first question and answer here, my kind
Hmm.
of initial idea of one type that I wanted to make the case for. It was important for me as I started thinking about it as a book to try to acknowledge a few different types,
Hmm.
that contested history that my subtitle suggests. So I do think that part of the problem that we have is that we assume a lot of the time that there is one version, there's one
Hmm.
definition. And in the book, I do deal with that type that I think is the kind of default that we often assume. It's the one that I call celebratory patriotism, which is the
Mhm.
category that is, 4th of July celebrations and singing the Star Spangled Banner with hand on heart for the US version of it.
Mhm.
Those kind of collective celebrations of a place that we love and are proud of. Proud to be an American, that kind of
Mhm.
phrase and idea. To me, that's the sort of often the default when we talk about patriotism is that celebratory patriotism, that type. And I should say, I am not someone who thinks that that is necessarily a bad thing. I think it does have work that it can do in kind of like uniting us and making us be a community together. Um, but it has to be inclusive. It has
Mhm.
to be able to include everyone
Mhm.
and sort of all the layers of us, all the layers of
Mhm.
American history and identity. And a central problem, I argue in the book, with that default definition is that it can really easily slip into a second type, which to me is the most destructive type, the most damaging, and I think
Mhm.
one that we see all around us now, perhaps especially, although it's always been with us. And that's the type I call mythic patriotism, which is really about excluding. It's a version
Mhm.
of patriotism that depends on leaving out people and communities. And that includes leaving people out from the vision of America that's being
Mhm.
celebrated, saying only certain things are what we are celebrating and other things are definitely not. They're just excluded from that. But then it also excludes people who disagree. People who say that's not the vision of America that I want to celebrate. That's not the vision I want to define. In that mythic patriotism narrative, they are excluded entirely. They're not patriotic. They maybe are not even American in that narrative. So celebratory, this default version, this version that could link us all, really easily can slip into this mythic patriotism that says you either celebrate these things in this way or you're not patriotic. And so then the goal of the book was to identify a couple types that can be alternatives to those, that can represent other possibilities. One of which was the one I've already talked a good bit about with Baldwin and Martin and the like, which is what I call critical patriotism, the kind that says, no, in fact, it is by critiquing that we are the most patriotic, that we are pushing the nation to be its best self. And that's ultimately the duality between the mythic type and the critical type is really at the heart of my book, I think, in a lot of ways. And those competing definitions, I think, are a lot of what I'm trying to
Mhm.
trace and argue for. But I do think the fourth category offers something important too, because even when celebratory patriotism is not mythic, even when it's not that destructive type, it can be really passive. It can say,
Mhm.
there's nothing we really have to do other than just be part of the celebrations. Just put our hand
Mhm.
on our heart, just sing along, just watch the fireworks.
Right.
And I think it's really important to say that there's an active alternative. There's an alternative that says, no, to be patriotic is to be in service, is to sacrifice, is to do active work. And so this idea of active patriotism as the fourth category opens up those possibilities, opens up the idea that there's a place for more active service, sacrifice, work,
Mhm.
protest, uh, Union Army soldiers during the Civil War, all kinds of categories that we can define as taking action
Mhm.
to push the nation in more patriotic ways. So I think those four categories were ultimately what opened up the book for me, was thinking about there's this huge contested history of these different
Mhm.
alternatives, these different possibilities. And then we can try to trace them and highlight them across history in different moments, in texts and so on. And so I do think ultimately there isn't a definition. It is
Mhm.
about this idea of trying to emphasize the best version of our nation. But
Mhm.
it really depends whether we do so through passive celebration or active work, and whether we do
Mhm.
so through excluding or being critical to try to be more inclusive. And those kind of four types are the different variations that I try to think about.
So, kind of a trick question that personally I'm interested in, of course, because of the way I work, what my work is on, but then I think also because it's oftentimes a confusion. So how would you distinguish between patriotism and nationalism? Where would you draw the line? Where would you draw distinctions between the two? And I will have a follow-up then too on that.
I appreciate it.
So,
And that's something that I should have dealt with more in the book, but I had the chance to keep thinking about a lot after through book talks and conversations and
mm,
great questions. And so I've really appreciated that because it should have been a fifth thing in there, at least a little bit, for sure. And so I appreciate the chance to talk about it. I would say that the mythic type, that
hmm
exclusionary, destructive, divisive type, certainly is trending that way. It's trending
Mm-hmm.
toward things like us versus them narratives, for
Mm-hmm.
example, because
Mm-hmm.
I think nationalism really depends on that us versus them framing.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the difference, I suppose, if I were going to parse it a little bit, is that I would say the us versus them of nationalism is the US versus the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of us versus them, that there's the we and then the rest of the world are sort of the
Yeah.
adversary. And
Mm-hmm.
I think mythic patriotism does it even internally. It
Mm-hmm.
says there are just
Yeah.
as many thems here
Mm-hmm.
in that exclusionary way, in that problematic way. So I think they're kind of complementary that way. I think mythic patriotism is exclusion of fellow Americans, and I would say nationalism is a little more that us versus them exclusion of anyone and everyone else. But I think they work hand in hand because they both depend on that us versus them. They depend on that idea that the only way that we can define the positive, the we, is by defining all these negatives, all these adversaries, all these thems. And I think the follow up to that, of course, is what that means about how we then deal with these thems, right? And so mythic patriotism in the US has very often done things like what we're seeing now,
Mm-hmm.
deportations, right? Exclusions of people who are defined as not part of the us, that they have to be expelled. And nationalism, of course, seems pretty inevitably to lead to war, right? To lead to
Mm-hmm.
violent conflict with the thems who are defined as in opposition to the us. So I think they really are complementary. I think they both exclude, they both depend on us versus them, mythic patriotism and nationalism. It's just a little bit maybe of the sort of domestic and the international.
Mm-hmm.
But I really would link them. And I think they are, in a lot of ways, the forces that most
Mm-hmm.
consistently lead to these violent conflicts
Mm-hmm.
internally and globally, as far as I would define it anyway. So I do think they relate. And I think it would have been a good thing in the project. And I really always appreciate the chance to think about that kind of like global
Mm-hmm.
counterpart, which is how I would define nationalism.
Yeah, okay. Um, I want to, as I said, there will be follow up, and there's a
Yeah.
follow up. So one of the things I enjoy always when I did my nationalism work in it was the mid 19th century, and the way I kind of conceived of it was that the Benedict Anderson idea of like the imagined community, right? That there's an elite that in some form sings of these couple of aspects, ideas, documents, figures, whatever it is that unite us and that we all should believe in, and then they disseminate that down to the people. And when I was reading your book, in a lot of places it felt exactly like that, right? That there's sort of in the moment there's an elite or a group of people that says this is the nationalism, patriotism of this moment, and if you don't believe that, then you're not with us. And it is it is not static. It's shifting all the time, and it's nothing that is like tangible. There's like it has nothing to do with blood, it has nothing to do necessarily with race, because it can be Chinese one year, it can be Mexicans the next year, it can be the Irish in New York and the Mexicans in Arizona, right? It's like it depends on your region. So I kind of was thinking, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's well said. I would say, and this depends in part on how we also define the debates over America as
Hmm.
a kind of counterpart.
Right.
And so, I'll just say, cards on the table. My vision of that debate, the debate about American identity, is one that does, in a lot of cases, come down to questions of ethnicity and race, because
Hmm.
I think white supremacy has been so powerful at even when it shifts who it is targeting. I
Hmm.
totally agree. It has very consistently shifted who is targeted by it. But I think from the framing documents on, where the 3/5 compromise and the Declaration of Independence talking about slaves as a foreign body that were
Hmm.
imported to the U.S. by the King of England, I think from that moment on, there has been a link of a kind
Hmm.
of white centered, if not white supremacist, at least kind of white centered vision.
Hmm.
And then these narratives of other communities who at best can sort of approach that white American
Hmm.
vision through like the melting pot idea, but are not quite
I
that
prefer the salad
central.
bowl.
Yeah, me too, absolutely. And that's why, because so
Yeah.
often the melting pot has been used to mean everybody else
Hmm.
melting into white.
Yes.
And of course, that A is not going to happen. It leaves a lot of people out. And B depends on that white centered vision.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think in American history, I would argue a lot of the time that white supremacist or at least white centered vision has been that mythic definition, has been that
Mm-hmm.
definition that says that is the core of what America is, and that everything else kind of approaches that. But
Mm-hmm.
the follow up, as you just nicely put it, is I do think that has shifted a great deal over time, how it's applied, who it connects to, who it targets, who is and is not part of the we. And all of that is important to note because it does mean it can always be challenged and there's
Mm-hmm.
always room. It's not just one thing. And I think that is a really key part of seeing it as contested and
Mm-hmm.
evolving is that there's room to keep contesting it.
Mm-hmm.
But I also do believe one of the main reasons, for example, that we see right now so much intent to kind of cut all things that represent diversity in
Mm-hmm.
America is that it's much harder to sustain those myths when we recognize that we've never been homogeneous, right? When we recognize that, for example, some of the people who fought hardest for the revolutionary ideals during the revolution were enslaved African Americans who were fighting to say, no, these rights apply to us too.
Mm-hmm.
These freedoms apply to us too. And if we see that community as like founding fathers and mothers as
Mm-hmm.
well, then it gets much, much harder to see like the revolution as white centered in any way. And so I do think that lens opens up a lot of the debate between the mythic and these other kinds of patriotism,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly means that if we do have national identities, nationalist identities,
Mm-hmm.
they at least have to represent who's really been part of this place
Right.
rather than this more kind of limited homogeneous vision. So to me, that's kind of a linchpin for how I think
Mm-hmm.
about American identity. There definitely are ways that you could do it, though, that relate to class, for example,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and how consistently the working class and American workers have been, as you say, at best, sort of like the people to be disseminated
Mm-hmm.
to, if not actively excluded
Right.
by those elite voices. And so I don't want to say that mine is the only kind of pivot that we can
Mm-hmm.
use, the only pivot point, but I think they often do overlap as well, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of how these elite visions exclude so much
Yeah.
from their core kind of idea of America and patriotism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I, as you were talking, I also was thinking like, right, this is when you sing about today's debate with regard to patriotism and what you kind of mentioned of like who's the us or who's the them, whose narrative is being told and who's is not being told. It it feels, and commentators have said it in the last couple of years too, right? It's in many ways a battle over history. Like whose
Yes.
history are we talking? Whose history is like, I hate to say it's a big narrative that
Mm-hmm.
like which whose stories goes into the textbooks, and
Mm-hmm.
it seems like patriotism unfortunately does also sometimes manipulates in the history of we want to we only remember sort of. I like to always mention that to my students. We only remember what we want to remember that fits our
Mm-hmm.
narrative.
I agree. And I think part of why I'm an advocate for these more inclusive visions of patriotism
Mm-hmm.
is that it helps us remember more that we all can celebrate. I think part of the case I try to make anyway is it's not, again, not only is it not an either or of like patriotism and criticism or
Mm-hmm.
patriotism and inclusion or patriotism and diversity, but just as an example, one of the big efforts in the last 8 months or so, 7, 8 months, has been to eliminate from a lot of our collective memories stories of soldiers of color in American history,
Mm-hmm.
right? African American Civil War soldiers, Japanese American soldiers during World War II, all these communities of
How
color.
fitting. Tomorrow I'll be
Um,
talking about with some authors about the 54th Massachusetts.
Perfect. One of my favorite American histories. And those histories, which we for so long didn't remember well in America,
Mm-hmm.
right, did a terrible job remembering, and that have gradually started to get a little better at
Yep.
including in our collective memories.
And
Those are exactly things that we all can celebrate,
yeah.
right? If you're not an
Mm-hmm.
inveterate racist, if you're not a white supremacist, those are communities that represent the best of America, right?
Mm-hmm.
That represent that celebratory
Yeah.
patriotism, that active patriotism.
Yeah.
But we see these attempts to exclude them, to destroy the
Mm-hmm.
memories of them from national parks, from Arlington National Cemetery, from online spaces, because
Mm-hmm.
they don't fit that mythic narrative, because they don't fit that version. And so I do think it's really important to say that the alternative here is not doesn't lead us just to a place of like
Mm-hmm.
dismissing everything that is best about the place. In fact, I would argue it leads us to what is really best about
Mm-hmm.
our history, our identity, our community. Communities like that, like the 54th, or like the 442nd, the Japanese American soldiers during World War II,
Yeah.
or Native American communities of soldiers from every conflict in
Mm-hmm.
U.S. history, or et cetera, et cetera. These are examples of some of the best of our history, and yet a lot of these mythic patriotic narratives want to forget them, want to exclude them, want to erase them. And I think that's really telling because they're not really celebrating our best. They're just emphasizing that one vision, that one homogeneous narrative.
Mm-hmm. Got me there.
Sorry.
So you were going to talk for 3 minutes, longer. Uh, but no, I agree. I mean, I was for a long time in Macon, Georgia, and we had these ongoing debates about the Confederate monuments. We had a little rally after the Charlottesville, and you were in Charlottesville. You told me earlier in the conversation, like incident, and like Macon has a Medal of Honor recipient who was African American, but it's like it was hardly anything about that in town, and you had all these like Confederate monuments instead that we were debating about that like what could we put in their place? Well, there is something really beautiful we could put in their place, you
Yeah.
know. Um, that it sometimes feels also communities that are reluctant to kind of make that step.
Yeah, and I think part of it is this feeling that it's either or. This
Which is
feeling that
not.
it's not at all. It's not at all. And the only things that are being challenged, I would argue, are the examples of the worst of us rather than the
Yeah.
best. And certainly, the founding of the Confederate States of America, which doesn't mean like every individual soldier who served in the war, but it means the founding of a government that said, slavery is the cornerstone of our government and our efforts. Yes, that represents some of the worst of us, I would
Mhm.
argue, and we have to challenge that. But the idea, I grew up in Virginia, as you just noted, and I've been told by various people in my life, including a former social studies teacher, that I was kind of betraying my Southern roots by
Mm,
advancing certain ideas about the Civil War or whatever.
right.
But again, what that is doing is saying that the Confederate States as a government is equated with the South, right? It's this exclusionary vision of not just say the South overall, but even the white South, right? And we know, of course, that the white South was contested even during the
Hmm.
Civil War. There were Unionists, there were opposition, there were
Yep.
all these different perspectives, and so
Class.
that, yeah, for sure. Those mythic narratives depend on,
Mm,
again, creating those exclusions, creating those ideas. And the more we can challenge that, the more it's then an argument for this alternative kind of
mm,
inclusive vision, which I don't think is either or us versus them in the same way. It just says there are examples of our worst that we've
hmm
all connected to, and there are examples of our best. And how do we make the case for the one?
hmm Um, since I'm kind of keeping an eye on time, I think we'll have to do it part two at some point
Sure.
because
That's fine.
there's so much we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where I'm gonna be a little more selective in the talking points that I send you. And for those that are watching the video, I'm holding up the for those see it. For those that are listening, I'm holding up the book cover right now, which is the top has Colin Kaepernick kneeling during an anthem at a football game, which of course was a huge issue for a long, long time as he was playing football there. But I want to go with the Francis Scott Key's Key Star Spangled Banner because I think that personally I find always interesting, and it has so much with regard to the topic of patriotism in it. So let's start with the part I always find the most funny, right? The poem set to a British drinking song. How do you feel about that? How does that kind of like it just
Yeah,
it feels weird, right?
it does, but I love it. I think
Oh no, it's great.
it's it is great, and it's great especially not only because of the idea of like singing it in a pub with a pint, although nothing wrong with that, but the broader idea that we are this cross-cultural place, right? That
Hmm.
these that everything in us, probably especially the things that people sometimes think of as like homogeneous,
Yeah.
is so mixed, is so
Mm-hmm.
combinatory, is built out of different traditions, different heritages, different communities, different legacies. And then they get built into these
Mm-hmm.
things that we see as kind of shared and defining. And there are problems with the anthem that we'll get to, I'm sure, but the idea that it comes out of both the legacy of this drinking
Mm-hmm.
song that had multiple kind of other poems and versions, and then this very specific historical moment during the War of 1812, and this
Mm-hmm.
young lawyer who's taking part in that, and that those things get assembled
Mm-hmm.
into what gradually becomes, and not right away, it's only under Woodrow Wilson that it's made the
Mm-hmm.
official national anthem. So
Yeah.
for like a century, gradually becomes one of our main kind of texts, one of our main shared celebratory patriotic texts. That's all America. That's all kind of how we work. And the more we learn about that, again, it doesn't mean we like destroy it all. It means we build more of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We get that sense of like these different legacies, these different places. So I really love that. And I think even though there are problems, especially with the later verses of the Star Spangled Banner, the overall idea
I
that
was
it's,
just gonna get to that.
yeah, let's get to that. We should get to that too.
Because I mean, it when you look at the Star Spangled Banner and you look at like I always did that in my survey class when I turned that
Mhm.
into a public history memory kind of perspective, and it's like you look at the Marseillaise, you look at the Mexican anthem from 1848, you look at the American anthem eventually, Star Spangled Banner. They're really violent, blood-soaked items, right?
Mhm.
This is about wars, this is about conflict, this is about destroying your enemy.
It is. And, during a war, obviously, I get that. And it is the one time when that nationalist, us versus them, of course, has some literal necessity, right? If you were
Hmm.
involved in a foreign war. And the War
Yeah.
of 1812 was a really complicated one in terms of how it started and what was happening. But there's no doubt that the British were
Hmm.
sort of seeking to overturn the American Revolution in part, right? Invading, burning the White House, et cetera. There were certainly attacks that were ongoing. So I get composing a poem that is about resisting those attacks,
Hmm.
right? That is about a community sort of standing in the face of this idea of invasion and destruction. But my problem with particularly the third verse of the Star Spangled Banner, which is the one that is almost never performed, it's usually just the first verse, and then there's four total. And my real problem is again that it creates an us versus them that isn't just about the British.
Hmm.
It's also, I would argue, it's a few words, but I think they're important words that are about people within the United
Hmm.
States who are also being defined as the enemy, as thems. And so there's a phrase, for example, the hireling and the slave,
Hmm.
as part of what Key is defining as these enemies who have been conquered by
Hmm.
the military victories. And to me, those open up to these much larger histories of American communities like enslaved people
Hmm.
who, since the revolution, had been often defined as potential allies of the British and enemies of the revolutionaries or the colonists. And there's a very complicated set of histories there.
Hmm.
But as I just made the case for a couple minutes ago, a lot of the voices during the revolution who made the case for the
Yeah.
revolution were enslaved African Americans. And certainly many of those who fought during the War of 1812 continued to be, including, for example, at the Battle of New Orleans, which had this amazingly diverse community for the American
But
forces. And so that's my real problem with the military rhetoric, the wartime rhetoric of the
hmm.
Star Spangled Banner. Again, it is a moment of war,
Yeah.
but it's a moment where Key is also saying there are these U.S. communities that are also part of the them.
Hmm.
And it's not unrelated to the fact that Key was himself a slave owner for much of his
Hmm.
life and was a lawyer who represented slave owners a good bit of the time as well in his native Maryland, which was a slave owning state up until the
Hmm.
Civil War. And so, slaveholding state. And so, I think all of that then becomes part of that military rhetoric in
Yeah.
the anthem, which can exclude and can exclude not just like an enemy during a war, of
Hmm.
course, but also fellow Americans.
Right.
And that verse isn't sung that often, so it's not literally present in the way that we often perform the anthem, but it is part of that history. It is part of that moment. And it does kind of remind us of where often, for example, our wartime rhetoric goes, right? Whether it's, Japanese internment camps, concentration
Hmm.
camps during World War II,
Yeah.
or attacking protesters
Hmm.
as un-American during war, right? That the military rhetoric can often lead to exclusions, and we
Hmm.
definitely see that in the anthem as well.
Yeah. And I mean, in part, you kind of also see, like the you saw during the protests, right? Of
Yeah.
like, how dare you take this
Hmm.
patriotic moment and use it as a protest moment? And it's like, I mean, when people said that, I was always like, well, would you pay attention otherwise?
Right.
You know,
Hmm.
it's the one moment where you're all paying attention. Like, and uh, but the other part there, I think, is sort of this oddity that I always struggled with explaining to my students that it's like the United States is the only country that plays the national anthem at all these domestic sporting
Right.
events. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note, and I had said a few minutes ago that it's only under Woodrow Wilson that the anthem becomes kind of like the official,
Hmm.
voted upon or at least proposed by his administration. I think Congress also voted national anthem rather than just
Hmm.
a song that is kind of a
Right.
popular anthemic song. And I think it's really important to note the timing of when that happens, right? Which is the
Hmm.
exact moment that Woodrow Wilson has also argued for and gotten Congress to pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act, for example, says that it is literally illegal to say, and it's a whole list of adjectives. It's like base, vile, negative words of any kind about the flag of the United States. That's one of the things that is being defined as something that cannot be legally criticized under the
Hmm.
Sedition Act. You can't say anything negative about the flag. And that's really the moment that the anthem becomes this sort of vehicle for
Hmm.
what I would argue is that kind of mythic patriotism. That if you're not standing with your hand on your heart, you are suspect at best and really pretty explicitly
Hmm.
unpatriotic and un-American. And that's a very different thing from, again, having something that can be like a shared experience or a shared
Hmm.
moment, is saying, if you are not exactly in this particular moment of performance following the passive rituals that are preordained, you are outside entirely. And that
Hmm.
certainly is the mythic patriotism. It's that us versus them nationalism. And I think that then builds into how it so often gets used at events, right? Is that
Hmm.
it's not just a moment of celebration, it is a prescribed performance.
Yes.
And you're either with it or you're not. And Kaepernick challenged that, as
Hmm.
others have over time. And I think, as you said, we saw in the response to that. Um, Another example that I'll note is with the Pledge of Allegiance, which I talk
Hmm.
about a lot in my Gilded Age chapter in the book,
Yeah.
which started as really like a critical patriotic text, I would argue, from a socialist minister, a Christian
Hmm.
socialist who was really trying to push the nation forward. But then the way the Pledge of Allegiance gets used in practice is the same
Hmm.
thing, right? There have been students who've been expelled because they didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. There have been people who've been assaulted,
Yeah.
beaten by teachers because they wouldn't say
Yeah.
or stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. So these things, even when they are really not that mythic patriotism, can be
Hmm.
turned into those kind of rituals that are so exclusionary and so divisive in that particular way.
Yeah, no, I'm, I mean, I'm glad you used that ritualistic kind of narrative and word choice there because that's being the outsider. I am a US citizen these days, but I was also a and am still a German citizen as well. It it always felt weird that you go to the sporting event and this is going on and it's like then you play ball and it's like it felt more of like I remember this I think it was a softball game and the commentators there sort of said, well, when I got to the ballpark, there was always this routine that I went through before I went out on the field and played. And it feels like for a spectator, that this is what the anthem is part of, that it's sort of like you go through these motions into the game, that it's just it's a ritual more than anything. And it reminds me when we were in Macon, Georgia, we had a summer league baseball team and collegiate baseball league in town.
Mhm.
And the people on the front of the stadium, this is not in the stadium, on the front of the stadium, the loudspeakers were playing the anthems. They were all standing there, heart, hand on heart, and you were kind of like, you're not even inside. Why are you doing this? Um, and it's so
Yeah, and
pervasive.
it is. And again, part of what gets exclusionary then is that it doesn't create that
Hmm.
opportunity, as you had said about
Right.
Kaepernick's protest, it doesn't create an opportunity to try to think. And I know you can't necessarily in like a minute long verse of a song, but even more broadly than that, to try to think about the histories behind it, the different
Hmm.
possibilities, the different ways one might celebrate, the
Yeah.
different ways one might express a connection to a nation. And not only does it not think about them, but it again prescribes them.
Hmm.
It makes them not possible
Right.
as anything other than a problem, as anything other than a negative alternative. And I think both mythic patriotism and nationalism depend on, again, not just passivity
Hmm.
and passive kind of performance, but also a lack of critical thinking, right? That
Hmm.
because there's this idea that critical thinking leads only to challenge as opposed to deepening, right? And part of the goal of this book, part of the goal of close reading, part of the goal of a lot of what I
Hmm.
do is to think that critical thinking can lead to a deepening of the things we feel,
Hmm.
right? Rather than an alternative to the things. And I think that's certainly true of the anthem moment, right? That if we really try to think critically, it can deepen our attachment to something more genuine and shared rather than something passive and kind of simplified. Another example of that is the places that now I think really beautifully read the Frederick Douglass Fourth of July speech
Hmm.
as part of Fourth of July celebrations.
Yep.
That's a deepening of that moment.
Yep.
That's a multi-layered moment. That's not just a like challenge to the Fourth of July.
Hmm.
That deepens what the Fourth can mean. And anybody who sees it as a challenge has a really, again, sort of passive vision
Hmm.
of what the fourth could be. So I think each of these are opportunities for deepening, but the deepening has to come through kind of collective
Hmm.
engagement and communal expressions beyond just those rituals, beyond just the most passive versions, anyway.
Yeah, and uh, I'm going to put the book aside for a second because
Yeah.
there's a quote or a passage I want to talk with you a bit about in a minute. It's again very contemporaneously important, but the 4th of July, right? It's like it is such an important part of the patriotic assembly in the United States, and it's sort of hard to pinpoint what does it mean, right, for people. And it's like, is it the day where you barbecue with your family? Is it the day where you launch a massive firework assault on your neighbor and give PTSD attacks to your veteran neighbor across the other side of the street? Or is it like this moment where we think about like what does it mean to be part of the country? And it's sort of an oddity in that the force, depending on where you are, who you're with, can be very exclusionary, but it can also have the possibility to be inclusive, depending on your neighborhood in many ways.
It definitely can. And I want to say again, as I said when I was talking about celebratory patriotism earlier in the conversation, I I do think there's a place for I hear you on fireworks and PTSD. You got to be thoughtful about your neighbors that way. But like we
Oh,
used to
my
take
dogs. My dog is hates
right,
fireworks.
dogs. Yes, dogs. Another example. We got to be thoughtful about that. But like when my sons were young, they're 19 and 18 now. But when they were young, they loved going to our town in Massachusetts to the Fourth and the fireworks. And
Mhm.
I think those kind of just
Yeah.
collective celebrations can be beautiful things as long as they are
Mhm.
thoughtful and respectful and inclusive. So I don't have a problem with them. And I don't think every minute of it has to be like deep, reflection and thought. There's a space for just celebration and barbecuing and the
Yeah.
like. But then including in them something like the Douglas speech, these moments
Mhm.
to say, and let's also think about how our history has developed, who has and has not been included,
Mhm.
and the voices that have argued for the more inclusive vision, like Douglas. It's just an and. It's an add. It's a both and. It's not an
Mhm.
either or. But as we have been talking about here for a while, so many people see it as an either or. Would see the Douglas
Mhm.
speech as like an attack
Right.
on the fourth rather than a part of it.
Right.
And I think a lot of this comes down to go back to the George R. R. Martin quote.
Mhm.
It's not either or, it's both and. It's fear and bravery. It's critical and celebratory. And I think the fourth can be that. And I've
Mhm.
I've been around those celebrations, and I think that's the ideal for me. So,
I just needed to check your index real quick. Thanksgiving.
yeah,
That just came through my mind when you said that, right? Of like
right.
Thanksgiving is a perfect example of like
Yes.
how easy is it to like like I always had moments where it was beautiful that I was the international student on campus and there was somebody who invited you to their American dinner and
Mhm.
tried to be inclusive about it. But then you have the other part, right, where indigenous people say, well, what are we celebrating here with Thanksgiving?
Mhm.
It's it's the genocide and attack on America, right? So it seems like Thanksgiving is a great example too for these kind of debates about patriotism that you're talking about in your book.
It is, and the only reason I guess it's not in there is that I start with the revolutionary period, and it would have been interesting to look at that at the pre-revolutionary development of these narratives for sure. And a great example of what you're just saying, there's a guy at Plymouth in the 1970s, a Native American activist named
Mm,
Wamsuta James, Wamsutta, Wamsuta James, who is the first to come up with the idea of a national day of mourning as an
hmm.
alternative to Thanksgiving.
That wasn't that
And
the first year or around there when the first time they symbolically buried Plymouth Rock too?
yes, I
Yeah.
believe that was, yeah. And I really love that because I believe in his framing, and I certainly think in a lot of the framing of it, that
Hmm.
again, it's not either or. It's
Yeah.
not saying we can't have these beautiful spaces for
Hmm.
family and good food and
Yeah.
community and celebration, but we can also do some of that work of mourning
Hmm.
of some of what this holiday has meant for many, many Americans and their
Yeah.
communities. And
Yeah.
again, that both and I think until the and is part of the celebrations of the fourth, of the Pledge of Allegiance, of Thanksgiving, it's of the anthem,
Hmm.
until the and is part of it, it is, even if someone doesn't want to kind of personally admit it, it is exclusionary
Yeah.
because there are these things that we have to leave out if we're not willing to include the reflection and the criticism and the more complicated things. And when we leave those things out, that means we're also leaving out American communities, right? If we leave out Douglas, we are really ultimately leaving out enslaved people and
Hmm.
what the fourth and those there. If we leave out the day of mourning, we're leaving out indigenous
Yeah.
communities. And so even though I don't think the celebrations are always necessarily exclusionary, they don't have
Hmm.
to be. So much of the time, that is a byproduct if we're not willing to include and have the and, have this other layer. And so it's not necessarily bad intention, but the effects can still be that exclusion
Hmm.
if we're not willing to do that work together. And again, when we do that work together, for me, it enriches it, it deepens it. I think it's
Hmm.
just important to come back to that and say,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean then that there's no place for the celebrations. I think they get
Hmm.
more rich and meaningful
Yeah.
when they have these layers to them. That certainly is the goal, I would say, anyway.
Well, since you point to a lot of the issues in your book, so let's briefly also talk about Thanksgiving as a force of like perfect examples where we could talk maybe also how we do that, right? I think in like when I taught my class about Plymouth Colony, one of the things I showed was like this cartoon of the landing of the Mayflower on Plymouth Rock and like the pilgrims going on land and the Native American who mysteriously speaks English
Right.
being able to help them and
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. So there's sort of like from grade school built in all this mythology
Mm-hmm.
that kids being told and their parents teach them those things. And by the time they get to you and me in college at some point, in my past, your current situation still, they already have all these myths in their mind. And we have to unteach that on
Mm-hmm.
some level because they think this is the reality. And it's like, no, that is not the reality. We created that so that you have this feel good story of the past.
For sure. And I think a big part of the way that we do that, and I know we do it in classrooms, but I think we can also do it collectively in society,
Mm,
is through stories and figures, right?
yeah.
It goes back to that interest of mine in narratives. I think if we just present these as like ideas that we need to add in,
Hmm.
that can be a lot more sort of abstract or harder to kind of really
Hmm.
want to grapple with, especially at a celebration or a
Yeah.
collective kind of moment. So that's why I like the Douglas speech
Hmm.
or the really interesting life of Tisquantum, of
Yeah.
Squanto, the guy who you
Yeah.
partly were talking about, who did speak some English because he had been enslaved and had gone to
Yeah.
Europe and then
Yeah.
had come back from Europe and worked as this go-between between the
Hmm.
Wampanoag and the Pilgrims and really complicated guy. but
Yeah.
really important to that early moment and
Hmm.
really representative of like that cross-cultural
Yeah.
America. And so if we include that story when we're thinking about Thanksgiving, or if we include Francis Bellamy, the guy who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, when we think about the Pledge of Allegiance and his complicated story,
Yeah.
um, I think stories and figures can really open things up for
Hmm.
students, for all of us, in a way that then can lead to some of these other conversations. So not just like sort of wagging our finger and saying that's not the whole thing, but saying let's include Douglas in this, let's include Tisquantum in
Hmm.
this, let's include Bellamy, let's include you know those enslaved people during the
Yeah.
revolution and their voices. I talk a lot about these Massachusetts folks, Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman,
Hmm.
who sued for their freedom in Massachusetts during the American Revolution using the language of the Declaration of Independence and the Massachusetts state constitution, and said, you say all men are created equal in these defining documents. We are people. We are suing for our freedom. Like, if we remember their stories, and those are just really interesting people
Hmm.
and stories, it changes the way we think about the revolution.
Hmm.
So these kind of really big things can happen through stories and figures and texts in that close reading way, that interdisciplinary way, that kind of narrative way that can then lead to a lot of these other broader conversations, I would say.
No, that sounds like a good approach to kind of think about like how we can reach and help the public gain a better grasp of this contestedness. Of course, I guess the hard part is how do you reach these diehards, right? Like, how do you reach the diehard neo-Confederate who's like, no, Civil War had nothing to do about slavery, or like
Right.
the American Revolution was this perfect moment in our past, and the founders were spotless characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The example I like to point to, and I agree. I mean, I think part of the ongoing debate in my own head is what is and is not possible as we keep having these conversations, and exactly what percentage of the people I share this place with
Hmm.
are just fundamentally opposed to how I want to think about the place. And that
Right.
would include, again, kind of inveterate white supremacists, right?
Hmm.
If you actively say America is only essentially white and
Right.
no one else can be part of it, that's going to be a hard one for me to have a
Right.
deepened conversation with. I would say, I
Sure.
have to hope. I have to hope for my own continued sanity and work that's a somewhat small percentage, and that the
Hmm.
larger percentage again see these things as threats,
Yeah.
see change, see these other narratives as threats rather than the reality that they are part of us as
Right.
well. And the great example of that I like to point to, I teach a lot of adult learning classes. It's something I really love
Mm.
doing, these classes for like retired folks or older, kind of
Hmm.
like a lifelong learning
Yeah.
students. I've taught in 4 different programs over the years, including one at Fitchburg State and others. And one of my early ones at Fitchburg State was on the Revolutionary period.
Mm.
And at the first class, I made the case that I did a few minutes ago here for thinking about these enslaved people in Massachusetts as examples of like founding fathers and mothers, as
Hmm.
much as someone like a John Adams in
Right.
Massachusetts. And one of the students in that class, it was the first of 5 meetings, 5 weeks. She was adamantly opposed to that idea. And it wasn't from racism. It was because John and Abigail for her were these founding fathers and mothers. They were that
Right.
vision of, they participated in the Declaration, the
Yeah.
Continental Congresses, the Second Presidency, et cetera.
Hmm.
And by the 5th week, she loved the stories of people like Elizabeth Freeman in Massachusetts and was on board with adding them
Hmm.
into the mix, and came up at the end of the last class and talked to me for a while about that. And so I think that's an example where it did feel like a threat. It
Hmm.
felt like I was saying, the way you see our history is negative and wrong. But I think I was able to convince her that I was saying, the way you see our history can have another layer to it. It can have other stories, other figures, other parts of it that are not opposed, that add in. And so I do think that's the difference. If someone is genuinely a diehard, again, kind of white supremacist or, neo-Confederate or neo-Nazi here in 2025, that's a conversation that is going to be real hard to push past. But if someone just is feeling under attack, is feeling that these
Hmm.
changes, these other narratives are threatening to the way they see America, patriotism, our
Hmm.
history, our identity, I get that. And I think it's possible to make the case that that isn't, in fact, what can happen. So I do
Right.
think those are the alternatives. And it's not easy to know exactly what we're talking about percentage wise, but I do have to believe, and I've certainly seen it with a variety of students and communities, that we can add
Hmm.
We can have this additive vision, this inclusive vision, without it feeling like we're just like flipping the us and them
Hmm.
or flipping the attacks. And I think that's a possibility anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem that oftentimes people think when we level those criticisms that it's like we're trying to take away
Mm-hmm.
from it, and it's like no, your part is still history, but it's
Mm-hmm.
there's other stories that also need to be told.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it's hard. This, having been in the South, yes, it's very hard.
Yes, it is. Did you have a quote that you wanted? I know you had said there was a
Yes,
quote in the
let's
book. Do
go
you?
back to your book because um I kind of wondered I know you are from Charlottesville, so how much did Sabato rub up on you with his crystal ball? Because it seemed like you had a crystal ball when you wrote this book.
Mm. Yeah, I do think with that thing like I want my country back, some of those developing narratives, or even just the birther movement, right? That there was this
Hmm.
national movement that
Yeah.
launched Trump to the, political
Yeah.
prominence, for example, focused on defining an American president as un-American, right?
Hmm.
As outside of America. And of course, there had been debates about our presidents throughout our history, but this was like defining questions, right?
Hmm.
Like this guy is not American at
Yeah.
all. And I
It's
think
almost
that
like
really,
Al Smith
yeah,
in the 19, I think it was
yep,
32, right? Or 28 or
28, yeah,
something like
28,
can't have a
for sure,
Catholic.
right. Um, but even that next level of saying he must not have been born here, right?
Yeah.
That it required this investment in a conspiracy theory beyond
Hmm.
imagining, right? Like an incredibly crazy conspiracy theory
Hmm.
to define this person as outside of the America that they wanted to define, the
Yeah.
America that they wanted to believe in. And I think I really saw those trends
Hmm.
as kind of leading to this bigger debate as well. That wasn't just about one person or one moment,
Hmm.
but was about this fundamental question of how we define America, how we define who's part of it and who's not, how we
Hmm.
define patriotism. And I don't think those are the only debates in the last decade, but I think they inform just about everything else really potently.
Yeah, no, and the one I found was it's in your early Republic chapter where you kind of talk about sort of the um alien and sedition acts that lead into
Mm-hmm.
your quasi-war and how like they're what they are. I mean, first of all, right, you have the Kentucky Virginia resolution sections, and then you kind of like you talk about the lengths of that the Alien Enemies Act is used again and again, right? Like in World War II, it's used against Japanese Americans, and it has gotten a new life, right? And it's sort of this um you you're just kind of pointing out that this is sort of the reality of it, but it's sort of interesting that you or at least I felt that it was interesting that you zeroed in on this as a topic. And of course, now the Trump administration is using this Alien Sedition Act as a means to remove people from the country.
Absolutely. And I do think another through line, I was talking earlier about kind of white supremacy as a through line in the
Hmm.
mythic patriotism. And a complementary through line is how many of those mythic patriotic narratives are
Hmm.
interested in defining American communities as alien, right?
Yes.
Defining them as outside. Um, and using that exact sort of legal framing, not just like
Hmm.
narrative, but legal framing to but also narrative, right? One of the ones I love to
Yeah.
point to is that Ben Franklin in the 1750s wrote a book where he argued that Germans were trying to Germanize everyone in Pennsylvania, something near and dear to your heritage and heart, right? The question of German American identity
Well,
in
this is
the
where we need
1750s.
Andrew.
Yeah, in the 1750s, Franklin says explicitly, it's we're either going to be an Anglo colony or
Hmm.
we're going to be Germanized. And then to his credit, by the end of his career, because he was a smart, thoughtful guy, he had completely changed his perspective. And he said, I was wrong. The Germans are a huge part of our community. He founds a college, Franklin College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to help serve that German American
Hmm.
community. So he is willing to change. He's willing to grow.
Right.
But so many of those narratives are
hmm
about that, are about seeing American communities as alien enemies, right? And the act just kind of legalizes that, right, toward particularly French Americans at the time, Franco Americans, and some others. And then, yes, time and time again, when these mythic patriotic narratives are being really fully developed and utilized, like by
hmm
Woodrow Wilson in the 19 teens or with Japanese internment
hmm
or in this current moment with the Trump administration, it's that framing, right? And it's that framing not only about new arrivals, which is already problematic in a lot of ways for sure, but also that framing about existing American communities,
hmm
longstanding American communities, multi-generational, deeply rooted ones as also alien enemies. And it really becomes this hammer that can be used to not only attack those communities, but again, suppress the idea of criticism,
hmm
right? Like ideological deportation that has become such a key part of our moment too, right?
hmm
That the stripping of citizenship from people,
hmm
the deportation of people by defining them as alien enemies, whatever their community, whatever their identity. So I do think it's a really central through line, and it relates to immigration in America, but it also uses those terms to define this us versus them in so many ways.
Well, it's odd because this is people that choose to be here, right?
Right,
You're not being forced to come to the United States in most cases.
right.
You're not forced to become a naturalized citizen. You're not forced to take on a green card. You choose to do that. You want to be there. And then to be classified as, oh, you're an alien, you're an enemy, we don't want you. Like it's a hard situation. Um,
It is, and I think that's exactly it. There was just um, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the tortured thinking of J.D. Vance, such as it seems to be, but he just had these remarks maybe a week ago or so, a couple weeks, where he was talking about how it's not enough to define America based on the ideals of the Declaration of
mhm,
Independence, because I believe his argument, tortured as it was that there are people who've been here all along who don't believe in the Declaration.
mhm,
And I think he kind of explicitly meant Confederates, for
mhm,
example, during the Civil War. And he said, but they, of course, are American because they've been here all along.
right,
And I'm not disagreeing that they're part of America. They certainly are. But it's that pivot, again, of saying it's not about
mhm,
the ideals,
right,
because the ideals include other people, right? They
mhm,
include immigrant communities, for
right,
example, who also believe in and share those ideals.
yeah,
And Vance's point seemed to be, as long as you're white and have been here, you are American.
mhm,
And if you're not white and have come here,
right,
you can't be somehow
mhm,
as American. And that really is that mythic patriotic narrative. And it, as you say, it makes no sense with the reality of how and why people
mhm,
come, but it also makes no sense with the reality of our history. Because
mhm,
again, at no point did we not have all these different communities. At no point, when the Louisiana Purchase happens, it
mhm,
brings into the U.S. communities that already had been there, Filipino communities in Louisiana, Mexican communities throughout the region, French communities in
mhm,
in the Midwest and the Upper Midwest, et
yeah,
cetera, right? They've always been part of the U.S.
yeah,
So it's not only wrong about how immigration happens, but it's wrong about our history, and
yeah,
yet it's this kind of defining vision of patriotism.
yeah. And while reading it and also talking here a moment ago, I think back to the moment when it was during COVID, I brought a ranger from Manzanar into class online digitally. So it was
Mm-hmm.
great. But her her way of talking about just how how this process transpired and then reminding the students, look, these are naturalized people. These are individuals who are born in the United States. They have no ties to Japan. They are not the ones attacking the United States, but they're being victimized, right? And it's like that you could really tell this moment where the students had to like think for a minute and it helped them kind of rethink notions or preconceived notions where it's like, yeah, she's right that this is the wrong community that is being discriminated against. Um,
Yeah, and at the same moment, at pretty much literally the same moment, you've got incredibly resurgent movement in the United States of a allegiance to the Nazi regime, right? You've got the
right.
Madison Square Garden rally in 1939 with 10,000 folks
Mm-hmm.
proclaiming that that rally was scheduled on George Washington's birthday to unite that mythic patriotic vision of America with the
Hmm.
Nazi Party. And I want to be clear. I am not saying that those folks were not American. They
Hmm.
were, and I wouldn't want them put in concentration camps. I disagree with everything they stood for.
Right.
But at that exact same moment, you've got folks being, or the origins anyway, of a policy that's about to put people into camps
Hmm.
based only on their ethnicity and their race, as you say. And so it really sort of drives home that point that it is not actually about the idea of like allegiance to the US, because that rally
Hmm.
was at least questionable in how we think about allegiance.
Hmm.
It's not about that. It is about seeing certain communities as American and certain communities as not, and thus as able to be something like
Hmm.
patriotic and not able to be patriotic. And so that's why one of my favorite stories of World War II is the stories of those Japanese American soldiers during the war,
Hmm.
who not only serve but serve, in the unit that is the most decorated in American history, right? Like,
Hmm.
again, anybody who is not a white supremacist who learns about that
Hmm.
has to be able to see that contrast between the mythic patriotic exclusion of that community
Hmm.
and the inclusive reality of that community in America. Like,
Yeah.
that's as crystal clear as it can get, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, now I'm at a crossroads. There's three different directions I want to take this. But I think the part that stands out in that is sort of the um Madison Square Garden, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you saw the video, I saw the video, and like hopefully a lot of the people listening to this saw the video that came out a few years ago about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it is so laced with American patriotic symbols, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's a big picture of the kind of sort of soldierly Lord George Washington there,
Mm-hmm.
and like the Pledge of Allegiance being recited. And I did love the comments that somebody put in there of like, oh, liberals altered this thing and created this because it didn't include "In God We Trust," and it's like
Right.
it wasn't there. You
Right.
can't include something that isn't there yet. Um, but it's laced with patriotism, right? They're thinking of themselves as good Americans, embracing this very misguided ideology.
Yes, absolutely they are. And I would pair that. I know this is a Civil War focused podcast a lot of the time. And I think we see that with the Confederate
Yeah,
founding as well, where the
yeah,
Confederates again and
sure.
again say, we are the true heirs of the revolution. We are the true heirs of the framers. Even while they're literally creating a separate nation,
Yeah.
they still want to make that case that they are the heirs of this patriotic America. And I do think that's really that heart of mythic patriotism, because if
Hmm.
they do emphasize that very one homogeneous, white centered
Hmm.
vision, then I suppose it would be possible to say, even as you're separating from the US in 1860, 1861, or even as you're proclaiming your allegiance to a political movement in a different country in 1939,
Hmm.
if you have this white centered vision, you can link that to an American patriotic history.
Yeah.
But again, it requires so much exclusion, so much that is left out in those moments by the Confederacy, by the Madison Square Garden folks.
Hmm.
And so, in each case, then just being able to dive into sort of what is opened up in those histories.
Hmm.
And then in 1939, to highlight, for example, that wonderful disruption by the Jewish
Hmm.
American kid Isidore Greenbaum,
Yeah.
who rushes the stage and says, "Nope, nope, it's my America too, and I'm at least
Hmm.
going to make my voice heard in this
Yeah.
moment," which requires excluding him
Hmm.
to say that it's patriotic at all.
Yeah. Yeah, but there is the other voice that says this needs to be a more inclusive
Yeah,
consideration. Um, so one of the last points for today, since we're definitely, I think, gonna do a second part on this.
great.
Uh, I, I I'll paraphrase this because I want you to understand where I'm coming from and where this is going.
Sure.
So when I turn my survey around from sort of a just standard Columbus or like ancient Americans to 61 or 61 to the present kind of, and
Hmm.
talk more in terms of like memory and remembrance and public history, one of the things I started with was Disney and
Mm.
how popular culture has sort of created frameworks for us in how we remember and how our memory of the past has been shaped. And the
Mhm.
Disney theme parks were usually one of the places I kind of went with that narrative. I usually did that sort of from the American West with Frontierland in the Magic Kingdom
Mhm.
and Disneyland, but I really love when you have the bicentennial message of Gerald Ford in your
Mhm.
book and how he talks about, and I can kind of you kind of quote him here briefly, that what is unique about the American adventure, right? The hallmark of the American adventure has been an eagerness to explore the unknown. 126 on in your book.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
just it just brought back memories because in Orlando at the Disney park, in the Epcot Disney park, they have an attraction that is the American adventure. And
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
traces from sort of like it starts with the Mayflower. It doesn't even start with ancient Native Americans, so it sort of like immediately
Mhm.
skews your vision a little bit. But it traces sort of the American history um, from Mayflower to where Disney likes to stop, 1945.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's like there's one woman in there. You have Frederick Douglass in it. It's overwhelmingly white individuals that they're presenting you with. And after 45, it sort of is just like the eagle floating through the air with images of like pop culture, like Marilyn Monroe and Walt Disney and a little bit
Mhm.
on Vietnam, but it's very like not they don't do much with it. But it's when you're in there, it is all about patriotism.
Mhm.
So this is this attraction in a theme park that a lot of foreigners come to that
Mhm.
is totally patriotic.
It is,
Take
and
it
it
where you
is a
want.
no. I mean, it's a great connection, first of all, and I do think it's important to really remember that a lot of the places and ways where these narratives get
Hmm.
developed are a pop culture, right? Things like
Right.
movies, as we were talking about earlier, and music, and it's part of why we need to analyze
Hmm.
them so fully. But also material spaces, right? The world around us, and it's why I'm such an advocate for thinking about them in historic sites, in museums, in all kinds
Hmm.
of spaces that can do the more thoughtful versions or the more
Hmm.
Disneyfied versions, the more
Hmm.
simplistic versions, and I think, in particular, the Disneyfied one, again, usually in my experience, unless we're talking about something really explicit like the "What Makes the Red Man Red" song in Peter Pan or something, usually these are not any overt exclusion, right, or any
Hmm.
overt.
Right.
It's more just that very Disneyfied, more simplistic narrative. But it depends on exclusion at the same time, right? Again,
Hmm.
not necessarily in an ill-intentioned way,
Right.
but that's the reality of what's happening, is that it's a
Hmm.
story that's being created and told that does seem to have that layer of patriotism,
Hmm.
but by excluding so much, and
Right.
excluding so much, again, as I keep coming back to, that could only deepen and amplify the feelings rather than just be challenged. I get that in the American adventure, you're probably not going to include long sections on, the genocide of Native Americans or the horrors of slavery. I get that. That would be a very complicated exhibit at best. But to not include all the American communities who have been part of those stories and have
Right.
contributed to the adventure of America, right?
Hmm.
A really great example of that, to go back to Frontierland, is like the Black cowboy community, right?
Hmm.
I forget what the percentage is. Historians now think something like 70%
Yeah,
of
it's
cowboys were
huge.
either African American or Mexican American, right, from different communities of color.
Hmm.
So if we're going to tell that story of the frontier, of course we should include those communities and think about their experiences and their stories. But we haven't, right? The
Hmm.
cowboy narrative is the white male narrative so much of the
Hmm.
time. And so again, just deepening the way we think about these things is such an important step. And I do think it can be part of the Disneyfication. It isn't a
Hmm.
given that it has to be so homogeneous, but it has been, and it has been a place where people get that homogeneous narrative, like they often do in other kinds of pop culture, at least historically. And again, we had entered a period where maybe we were starting to push back on those things,
Yeah.
and now we're in a moment where the pushback is being defined as unpatriotic and un-American, right? Where any attempt to diversify to represent our diverse realities and
Hmm.
histories is being defined as unpatriotic, as un-American. So it's even more important to push back and say, no, in fact, representing those diversities is the most patriotic American thing that we could try to do.
Right. Well, and like, I mean, yes, I like, I always get it, right? It's like you're on vacation, you don't want the hard stuff, you want
Right.
to feel good moments there, but it's like it it's also this sort of like how much how much is Hollywood, Disney, pop culture places feeding us things that they think we want to hear.
Mm.
You know, that that sort of like, oh, if my audience is overwhelmingly middle class plus affluent white
Mm.
who has very little diversity, do they want to hear these more complicated narratives?
Mm.
Um,
That is the assumption. And again, one of my driving forces for my career, as I've been saying here, I hope is yes, because they can give us such great stories and figures
mhm,
and histories. I think a lot of people will. Obviously, there are going to be people who resist, as we've been saying, but I think a lot of people, the more they learn about these things, again, the more it deepens their sense. Because I do, at the end of the day, I think part of what I find hope in is, despite the incredible roster of horrors in our history, I think this is a place, a nation, a community that has had incredibly inspiring
mhm,
stories throughout its history too. But the only way we get to them is with the diversity, with the
mhm,
adding, with the and. Otherwise, we just don't have a chance to get to them.
mhm,
It's that same George R. R. Martin quote again. I first used that in a book, in my 2016 book, that was for a long time about the idea of hard won hope, of like
mhm.
finding hope through the darkness. That was going to be the title of that book for a long time.
Ooh.
And I think that's kind of my point, right? Is that we're not going to get the real hope if
Mhm,
we're not willing to try to grapple a little with the darkness. We're not going to get the best. And I do think a lot of people will be able and willing to do that when we can share these stories and share these
mhm,
things. And that's exactly why the fascist forces want to get rid of the stories, because I
mhm.
think they recognize that too, that there's power in them and there's collective power in them.
Yeah, and I was just thinking like when we talked about like movies and sort of popular culture things, and it's like I was just thinking like I know Amazon wanted to do a Robert Smalls movie, but
Right.
I'm not sure if that has where that is these days,
Mhm.
if that ever will take place, or I guess we'll see in the future. But I mean, we had things like about Selma, about the Red
Mhm.
Tails, but it's very limited on like, and even when you look at a movie like 12 Years a Slave, you get Brad Pitt as the white savior in there, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, come on, Hollywood, why did you have to do this now? Um, and then you get blockbusters like Pearl Harbor
Mhm.
that then
Mhm.
foster sort of narratives, and it's sometimes Hollywood should maybe be a little more ambitious in what it does.
It
Um,
should. And just this year, in a film like Sinners, which blew away box office records by looking at this incredibly multicultural history of the 1930s South,
mhm,
and including different communities and different histories and different layers of culture. I do think a lot of times that idea about audience is underestimating
mhm,
what people can and will kind of connect to and
right,
enjoy. And a great example of that I like to highlight is the idea that say white American audiences can't identify with
mhm,
stories and histories of other communities, right? I
mhm,
absolutely believe that we can. And the
yeah,
same with school children, right? There's this narrative that if you teach kids about these other communities and histories, they'll be ashamed. White
mhm,
students will be ashamed.
right,
But they could just as easily be inspired, right? They could just as easily connect to these stories and
mhm,
histories. That's part of what we can do as humans, is connect outside of just our own identity and our own experience. So if we tell these stories, if we share them, I absolutely believe
mhm,
people can and will connect to them from different
yeah,
backgrounds and different communities. And that's that idea then of, say, a critical patriotism. Is
mhm,
about it's not about the criticism.
yeah,
It's about using that lens to push us to be our best self,
mhm,
a version that can include everyone and can be closer to our ideals rather than these very divisive
Hmm.
realities that we've experienced so much. And I think ultimately that's the work that we're either going to do
Hmm.
together or we're just going to deepen the divisions. I think those are the choices we've got. And obviously, we're trying for the first one of those anyway.
Yeah, and when I think back to sort of like one of the historic sites I enjoyed the most was McLeod Plantation in Charleston, South
Mm,
Carolina. And
mm,
it's like it I find it personally even more interesting than the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. They give you a tour, they take you through like they don't even take you through the house, none of the buildings, but they tell you for like an hour the story of this
mm,
plantation of enslaved people laboring here and the houses in which they lived and where they lived after emancipation for almost for over another 100 years in many cases.
mm-hmm,
And what always struck me was that was the audience was overwhelmingly white. It wasn't African American, where Whitney is very heavily African American as an audience, and the River Road plantations are more white.
mm-hmm.
But McLeod's plant audience is again very much white, and the people stand there with the tour guides for 40 minutes afterwards, still talking. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they want that. They want these stories. They want to learn it, and like that sort of like signals there's the hope for that celebratory
Yeah,
patriotism.
there is. I
Right.
really think there is. And I've seen it in every different community that I've been able to
Hmm.
connect to, from young students to retirees to different kinds of talks and communities of all kinds. And I do think there's a reason why the forces opposed to this are trying to limit, again, what we learn, what we teach, what we know, because when we do those things, it does deepen, it does add, it does enrich. And
Hmm.
that's at the heart ultimately of this battle between these different forms of patriotism is figuring out what we can do together to move us forward.
Yeah.
And not give in to those ideas that it has to be the us versus them, that it has to be
Hmm.
the division. And that's a big part of why I care so much about these ideas and
Hmm.
try to keep thinking about them and talking about them and all these great opportunities to do that is that I think the stakes of that are really high for how we move forward together.
So, kind of since the book has been out for a little bit, and you said you had done some talks and conversations, and where did you like where did you feel like the most reception, like positive reception? Was there any negative reception, like talks that were kind of combative at all?
I have not had that experience in particular of really combative ones. I've certainly had interesting questions about things like nationalism.
Hmm.
I've had pushback, certainly pushback on the idea that patriotism itself can be a real negative,
Hmm.
and that arguing for it is maybe giving into that negative. And I really appreciate that pushback because it
Hmm.
helps me think about how I want to argue for it and when and
Hmm.
how we shouldn't. So I've had that pushback for sure. I haven't. I guess the place I have had more pushback, I would say, from more overtly sort of oppositional perspectives is in online writing.
Hmm.
I write a column for the Saturday Evening Post every 2 weeks or so,
Okay.
and I've dedicated. Sorry about the sirens. I've dedicated a lot of those columns to some of these histories and stories over the last few years, for sure. And there are commentators there. There are people who will leave comments that are from a pretty overtly kind of far right perspective and want to see this one vision of American history, this one
Hmm.
narrative. And I do think there are the two varieties of that. There are
Hmm.
those who are just so wedded to a kind of white centered vision
Sure.
that it's really hard to break through. But
Hmm.
then there are those who do see this as like attack, who see this as just a negative challenge. And I
Hmm.
think there is space there for continued conversation. So I think that is the difference
Yeah.
is it about trying to shift the narrative from like a divisive attack to an
Hmm.
additive conversation?
Hmm.
And if so, there's work we can really do. When it becomes just, again, a sort of white centered, white supremacist vision, at a certain point, I just say, okay, that's not the America I live in. I also don't believe it's the America that's ever been here. You
Hmm.
could try to make a case for it in the future, I guess, if you want. But I do think if you know
Hmm.
our history, it's really hard to see that as the past. It's hard to see that as what we've ever actually been. And that I'm willing to say to someone if they have that perspective, like, okay, you want to make the case for that, go for it. But it's not who we've ever been. It's just not the America we've
Yeah.
been. So there are these different responses. And they're all worth trying to engage with, but I
Mhm.
certainly think the bigger conversation of changing the way we think about the us versus them can happen. I think that is
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah. So as the final point for today, at least, I let me think, how long ago was this? I was still in Arkansas, so this must have been like 2012 or 13 about. We had Patricia Limerick on campus, fallen a bit out of favor with some of the issues recently there in Boulder, but she made this really interesting remark that she was part of a study with regard to fracking in
Mm,
Boulder.
mhm,
And she kind of had to do community meetings. And a lot of these community meetings, she had people very angrily coming in of like, this is terrible, this is awful, this is destructive to us, this is environmentally damaging. And she kind of said that the way she handled this was to kind of turn this conversation around and be like, look, historically, we have always been an extractive industry community. It's just a different type of extractive industry. So she kind of tried to explain while taking the criticism or the issue into consideration.
mhm.
So that said, I kind of how do you address when you have sort of a critical person in the audience that asks a question? Do you kind of engage it more in a combative way? Do you engage it more in sort of a like let's look at this historically? Like what's your approach in that?
Yeah, I think what serves me really well is how much I love teaching and how much that's been a central part of my career. I've taught at
Mm-hmm.
Fitchburg State, which is a teaching first kind of institution that has a heavy teaching load, which I've been doing for these 20 years. And so for me, everything comes back to teaching a lot of the time as a central part of the work. And I think when we extrapolate that to all these other settings, public
Mm-hmm.
scholarship, talks, podcasts, whatever it is, when we think about them as part of that work as well, very few of us, I hope, and certainly not me, would ever want to think of teaching as combative, right? Or as like even
God
like a
no.
debate. Exactly. To me, it's not a debate, it's a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean it can't get fiery or it can't
Mm-hmm.
get to points of real disagreement, but we're all in it together, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
community, it's a conversation. And I try to think of all the work as doing that. And even if someone is coming at it in a more hostile perspective, and I've had, over the
Mm-hmm.
years, individual moments where students might feel more antagonistic or
Mm-hmm.
hostile. But still, the idea is how do we then deal with this as a community and a conversation
Mm-hmm.
and try to keep moving forward together because we are all here and
Mm-hmm.
we are all in it. And as long as you're not like directly attacking someone else in the community, if you're
Right.
doing that, that has to stop. That can't, there's no place for that. But if the ideas or the conversation are getting combative, we're still all in it together and we can still all be
Mm-hmm.
having that conversation. So that is really how I try to think about it. And again, it's that inclusive idea, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to be inclusive when we all just agree. It's harder to be inclusive when it is
Mm-hmm.
contested.
Right.
But as long as that contest doesn't become violent,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's possible for it to be community still. And I think, again, if we're going to move forward as a nation, we've got to figure out, broadly speaking, how
Mm-hmm.
we keep doing that. And
Right.
it doesn't mean, again, that every single voice is going to be able to be part of it, because if someone is a neo Nazi, that's a whole different ballgame. But it means that most of us have to be in that conversation
Mm-hmm.
and figure out how we do that without just becoming violent and hostile. So I'm a big believer in that. And I think the classroom is a really good model for it,
Mm-hmm.
for all of us.
No, I agree that it's important to kind of diffuse those moments and kind of use them as points of conversation starting
Yeah,
rather than anything else. Um, well, great. This was a great conversation.
it is.
As I said, there's still a lot of points on the talking point list that we had, and I know Andrew is oozing and drooling, wanting to meet you in person, at least on Zoom at some point. So we'll
I'd
try
love
maybe in
that.
the next 2 weeks or so to schedule something. We'll probably take a few weeks after that to release part two, but we'll
Okay.
maybe try and do that so that we can talk more about different things. And um, I'm also sure the Trump administration will do us a lot of favors with very weird policies that we could talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time today to already chat with me and on your vacation and at home. And
Of course, my pleasure.
uh, for those who have already been interested at this stage of Z.I. Sing, The Contested History of American Patriotism is a book from Roman Littlefield. So if you're interested, it's a beautiful cover too.
It
Made
is.
very fitting. I felt this was really nice. It's not that long, so it's a really
No,
easy read but a good read.
thank you so much, Niels. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Me too.